In the frozen silence of the Arctic Circle, long before satellite networks wrapped the globe, and long before nuclear submarines prowled the oceans like steel ghosts, the Soviet Union launched one of the most secretive naval experiments of the entire Cold War. An operation so classified that even today, much of its documentation remains sealed, altered, or quietly erased. This is the story of a lost Soviet submarine, a vessel that not only terrified NATO commanders, but also vanished into the Arctic with such finality that it became a myth whispered among sailors, a phantom that never resurfaced. Its official designation was never publicly released, its mission logs never declassified, and its disappearance never fully explained, leaving behind a chilling question. How does an entire submarine simply vanish from the Earth? Our story begins in 1961, a time when the Soviet Navy was expanding at a rate the West found staggering. Khrushchev had openly mocked Western navies by claiming that submarines, not battleships, would be the future of warfare. He wasn't wrong. Submarines were stealth, they were unpredictable, and in the Arctic, an environment hostile to human life, they could hide beneath the thickest ice sheets on the planet, unreachable, unseen, and armed with nuclear weapons capable of ending cities in minutes. But the submarine we are investigating today was not one of the new nuclear-powered leviathans that the USSR boasted about in parades and propaganda reels. Instead, it was an upgraded diesel-electric attack submarine, a relic of an earlier era, refitted for a mission no one wanted to openly admit, penetrating NATO's northern defenses, mapping weaknesses, testing acoustic gaps, and charting ice coverage so Soviet nuclear subs could slip undetected into the North Atlantic during wartime. The West would later call these boats phantoms because, unlike nuclear submarines, diesel subs could run nearly silent. They didn't pump coolant. Their engines didn't hum with reactor noise. When running purely on battery power, they were invisible to passive sonar, a nightmare for NATO. By 1961, 3 Soviet subs had already conducted Arctic operations, but only this one, this lost ghost, was fitted with a new type of experimental acoustic coating. It was expensive, difficult to apply, and completely untested in harsh polar temperatures. Moscow wanted to know 2 things. Could it evade NATO sonar entirely, and could it survive extended Arctic deployment without surfacing? What happened next left even Soviet admirals speechless. The submarine departed Murmansk under full secrecy, carrying a crew of 68 men. Families were told it was a routine training exercise. In reality, the mission briefing was chilling. The submarine was to transit beneath the Arctic ice near Svalbard, slip between NATO listening posts along the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, and gather intelligence on the exact positions of American SOSUS cables, massive underwater. Hydrophone arrays capable of detecting Soviet nuclear submarines thousands of kilometers away. This was a violation of international agreements. It was also inevitable. The Arctic was becoming the Cold War's new pressure point, a place where superpowers collided invisibly. And this submarine, cold, silent, and unacknowledged, was chosen as the spearhead. At first, everything went according to plan. Shortwave radio transmissions from the submarine were received by the Northern Fleet, confirming a successful dive beneath the ice. The experimental coating appeared to be functioning because NATO early warning radars and listening posts reported nothing unusual. But something strange happened 2 days into the mission. The submarine's transmissions became erratic. A scheduled status report came in late and incomplete. Then came a second report, encrypted but unusual. The message was longer than normal, and contained phrases not used in standard naval communication. There was a sense of urgency buried in the structured language, as if the crew wanted to say more but couldn't risk revealing their situation. The officer decoding the message later said it felt like a warning, not a report. And then, after that final, cryptic transmission, the submarine went silent. No distress call, no emergency beacon, no surfacing attempt. It simply vanished. At first, Soviet command assumed equipment failure. The Arctic played hell with electronics. But after 12 hours of silence, panic began to spread through the upper ranks of the Northern Fleet. Losing a submarine in training was catastrophic. Losing one inside NATO-patrolled waters? That could trigger war. Soviet intelligence quickly analyzed NATO communications, searching for intercepted chatter about a possible kill. There was none. The Americans and British seemed unaware anything had happened, or were they pretending? Meanwhile, aboard the submarine, whatever was unfolding remained hidden from the outside world. Theories later emerged from declassified fragments and testimonies of former officers. Some believed the submarine struck a moving ice keel, one of the most dangerous hazards under the Arctic. These jagged underwater shelves can extend downward like frozen mountains. One miscalculation could rip open a submarine's hull like paper. Others suggested mechanical failure. Diesel-electric subs had limited oxygen reserves, and a malfunction could trap them beneath the ice with no ability to surface. But the darkest explanation came from a former Soviet sonar technician decades later. He claimed the experimental acoustic coating had begun to detach in the freezing temperatures. The peeling layers would have created massive sonar noise, blinding the crew's own instruments and making the submarine effectively deaf. Navigating blind in the Arctic is suicide. But even that explanation didn't account for one disturbing fact. Soviet satellites recorded an unusual thermal bloom near the Ihul, submarine's last known position, a heat signature inconsistent with ice movement or natural ocean currents. It looked like an explosion. But if the submarine exploded, where were the debris fields? Oil slicks, metallic fragments. Rescue teams found none. In fact, they found nothing at all. No hull sections, no lifeboats, no bodies, no sign that a 90-meter steel war machine had ever existed. And here's where the story becomes even more unsettling. 6 days after the submarine vanished, NATO early warning radar in Norway detected something strange. A slow-moving underwater contact near the coast, too large to be a whale, too silent to be a nuclear submarine. Norwegian patrol aircraft were deployed, but the contact slipped back under the ice and disappeared. Some speculated it was the lost Soviet sub limping back toward friendly waters. But if the crew were alive, why send no communication? Why ignore Soviet search signals? And how could a disabled submarine move so deliberately? Moscow refused to confirm or deny anything. They simply expanded the search area and classified everything at the highest level. By week 3, the mission shifted from rescue to containment. The Soviet Union began covertly monitoring NATO activity around the Arctic, terrified that the Americans had recovered the wreckage and seized the experimental tech on board. But NATO had recovered nothing. Both superpowers were essentially hunting a ghost. The Arctic swallowed the submarine whole, and with it, the truth. The disappearance soon became a taboo subject within the Northern Fleet, a cautionary tale whispered among sailors about the ocean demanding payment for trespass. Families were told their loved ones died, heroes in an accident. No details were provided. Some were told their sons drowned. Others were told their sons froze. A few were simply told, "The sea took them." But decades later, when fragments of sealed files were leaked, a disturbing pattern emerged. The Soviet Union listed the submarine not as lost, but as inactive. Naval historians noticed this phrasing was unique. Submarines destroyed in accidents were marked decommissioned or destroyed. Only this one carried the classification inactive, a vague label implying the vessel was not confirmed destroyed, only unavailable, missing, possibly intact, possibly somewhere under the Arctic, its hull frozen into the seabed, its crew entombed in darkness where no human eyes would ever see them again. Or worse, possibly somewhere else entirely. What frightened investigators most was not the submarine's disappearance, but the subtle clues suggesting that the vessel may have still been operational in the days following its last official transmission, hints buried in sonar anomalies, scattered intelligence intercepts, and environmental disturbances that didn't fit natural patterns. In the fourth week of the search, Soviet hydroacoustic stations on Franz Josef Land picked up intermittent, low-frequency vibrations, unlike any biological source, too consistent to be shifting ice and too faint to be machinery on the surface. The signals seemed rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat echoing through the ocean floor. And though it wasn't Morse code or any known distress pattern, sonar analysts noted that the pulses resembled the cadence of an idling diesel engine struggling under pressure. If the submarine's batteries were failing, the crew might have attempted to start the engines even beneath the ice, a desperate and suicidal move since internal combustion, underwater, would quickly exhaust oxygen. But perhaps it wasn't an attempt to move. Perhaps it was an attempt to be found, to make enough noise for search teams to triangulate their position. Yet the signals stopped as suddenly as they began, leaving behind only speculation and a growing sense of dread. Adding to the mystery, an American reconnaissance satellite recorded a strange anomaly near Svalbard. A thin plume of vapor rising through a crack in the ice, resembling what might occur if warm air from a submerged vessel ventilated upward. The U.S. Navy dismissed it publicly as geothermal activity, but internal memos suggested analysts believed it came from a man-made source. This sparked fear on both sides. If the submarine was venting air, it meant the crew might still be alive, trapped under the ice with dwindling oxygen, fighting to survive as their steel world grew colder and darker. But perhaps the most chilling piece of evidence surfaced thousands of kilometers away in the Barents Sea, where a Soviet trawler reported hearing metallic echoes beneath their hull at night, a pattern sailors described as knocking from below. At first, the crew dismissed it as shifting cargo or nets scraping the hull, but the fishing captain later admitted the rhythm felt intentional, almost like tapping signals. When the trawler attempted to radio the fleet about the noises, the signals were jammed by a powerful burst of interference that lasted nearly 40 minutes, something only state-level equipment could generate. Someone, either NATO or the Soviets themselves, didn't want that report transmitted. Eventually, the Northern Fleet erased the trawler's logbook entry entirely and issued non-disclosure orders for the crew. This meant one thing. The Soviet Union believed the submarine was still out there, somewhere, and the government wanted the world to forget it. But another thread emerged years later, when a retired Norwegian defense official revealed that their SOSUS hydrophone arrays detected an unknown underwater object moving southwest at an impossible trajectory, from beneath thick Arctic ice into the Norwegian Sea, without surfacing, without speed spikes, and without reactor signatures. Only diesel-electric submarines lacked reactor signatures, But diesel subs could not operate indefinitely beneath ice without surfacing to recharge batteries. Unless some external power source, pulled or pushed them. Or unless the submarine was drifting, carried by deep polar currents. But that theory collapsed quickly because the object changed speed and direction multiple times, actions impossible for a vessel without deliberate control. In other words, something was steering it. But who or what was inside that submarine weeks after all 68 crewmen should have suffocated? Was it an automatic system glitched into motion, another submarine towing it, or a navigational error misinterpreting natural phenomena as movement? The signal was lost within 12 hours, leaving behind nothing but a baffled Norwegian report that was quietly suppressed. The Soviet Union, too, doubled down on secrecy. Engineers involved in the creation of the acoustic coating were suddenly reassigned, interrogated, or made to sign lifetime confidentiality documents. Families of the missing sailors were discouraged from holding public memorials, and the submarine's last known coordinates were classified indefinitely, buried deeper than files involving nuclear accidents or espionage. But the most disturbing revelation emerged in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and a handful of intelligence officers defected to the West. One brought with him a fragment of a document from the Northern Fleet, an internal memo that mentioned a phrase never before seen in naval terminology. Submarine remains unconfirmed but persistent. Persistent? Naval historians were stunned. Submarines don't become persistent. They are either located or gone. This suggested the Soviet Navy received recurring hints, sonar echoes, acoustic anomalies, environmental disturbances, indicating the submarine might be detectable at irregular intervals. As if it wasn't entirely destroyed, but not entirely functional either. Something in between. And then came the testimony of a former Soviet sonar officer, who during a late-night interview revealed something he had kept silent for 30 years. During a classified search operation months after the disappearance, his team detected a faint sonar return resembling a submarine hull. The size, shape, and acoustic shadow matched the missing vessel. But when they returned for a second sweep minutes later, the contact was gone. Not faded, gone. As if the ocean floor itself had swallowed the submarine or it had moved away at impossible speed. His final words still haunt Cold War researchers. We did not lose that submarine. It avoided us. But perhaps the most compelling and eerie clue comes from the ocean itself. In 2014, oceanographers mapping Arctic seafloor anomalies discovered a long, narrow indentation in the sediment, about 90 meters long, perfectly smooth, with sharp edges and uniform width. The exact length of the lost submarine. The indentation trailed off toward a steep drop-off, beyond which the seafloor plunged into a deep trench. Whatever made that mark entered the trench. But no debris was found, no metal fragments. The indentation ended abruptly at the trench's rim, and nothing lay below. It looked as if the submarine slid across the seafloor, then vanished over the edge into blackness. Scientists suggested seismic activity or a glacial scouring pattern, but privately, several admitted the mark looked mechanical, not geological. One described it as the sliding mark of an object guided, not drifting. Another comparison emerged. The indentation resembled the path left by submarines intentionally grounding themselves before resurfacing. But this one never resurfaced. If the submarine reached the trench, it may rest thousands of meters below, crushed into unrecognizable fragments. Yet deep-sea acoustic scans of the trench turned up nothing metallic. It was as if the submarine dissolved into the abyss, or continued traveling into depths sonar could not penetrate. And so the legend of the Arctic ghost submarine grew, not just a symbol of Cold War secrecy, but of the unforgiving nature of the polar oceans. Some sailors believe the submarine lies frozen into an iceberg, drifting slowly across the Arctic like a steel coffin waiting to thaw. Others think NATO recovered it secretly to study Soviet technologies. But the most haunting theory is the simplest. The submarine is still down there, intact, silent, entombed in dark Arctic waters, perfectly preserved by the cold. And perhaps, on some nights when conditions align just right, sonar stations still hear faint signals, the ghost of steel tapping from beneath the ice, trying to complete a mission long forgotten. As the mystery deepened, Soviet intelligence began to fear a possibility far more dangerous than mechanical failure or hostile engagement. What if the submarine had completed part of its mission before vanishing? Mapping NATO acoustic gaps with enough precision that its data, now unaccounted for, could fall into enemy hands or even destabilize the balance of power if misinterpreted. This fear was not irrational. A submarine lost near NATO waters was not just a tragedy. It was a geopolitical risk with the potential to ignite an international incident. If NATO recovered the hull intact, they could reverse engineer the experimental acoustic coding, decode mission objectives, or analyze classified Soviet navigation patterns. Worse, they might claim, rightly or wrongly, that the submarine was on an offensive intelligence operation, using its disappearance as diplomatic leverage. Because of this, the Soviet Union activated a covert recovery plan known internally as Operation Polar Curtain, an initiative involving deep-sea trawlers, disguised research vessels, and a shadow fleet of support ships operating beneath radio silence. These vessels crisscrossed the Arctic for months, dragging sonar arrays and magnetic anomaly detectors in tight patterns, attempting to detect any irregularity beneath the ice. But the Arctic defied them at every turn. Weather conditions shifted. Unpredictably, ice sheets fractured and reformed in hours, and the polar night consumed all light for months, creating an environment where even the most advanced technology felt primitive and blind. Meanwhile, Soviet leadership grew increasingly paranoid, suspecting that NATO might have already intercepted fragments of the submarine's transmissions. They were partially right. At a NATO listening station in Keflavik, Iceland, analysts had recorded a peculiar burst of encrypted communication roughly matching the submarine's last known movements, but the message was too corrupted to decode. American intelligence believed it was an emergency broadcast, but the Soviets feared it was something more. An attempt by the crew to reveal critical mission data if they believed rescue was impossible. To prevent panic within the ranks, Soviet leadership classified all records of the submarine's final transmissions under a special category, Class 7 Obscura, usually reserved for espionage cases and nuclear incidents. Only 5 individuals in the entire Soviet Navy had access. The rest were told simply to keep searching. But as weeks turned into months, the absence of physical evidence began to drive the search into a realm bordering on obsession, an obsession that cost lives. One Soviet search vessel, battered by shifting pressure ridges, was fractured along its hull and flooded within minutes, killing 14 crewmen. Another became trapped in sea ice and required a full evacuation under extreme conditions. Yet despite the danger, teams continued to return to the last known coordinates, performing acoustic sweeps that yielded nothing except eerie silences. Silences so complete that experienced sonar operators reported feeling uneasy, as though the ocean itself was swallowing sound. Some speculated that the Arctic water in that region possessed unique acoustic absorption properties, perhaps caused by subglacial sediment or unusual salinity gradients. Others believed something else was absorbing the sound, a mass large enough to distort sonar waves, but not reflective enough to form a clear picture. Only one sonar operator, years later and off the record, described what he heard: a shadow that moved. His report was buried immediately. And then, in the 5th month of the search, something extraordinary happened. A classified Soviet spy satellite, sweeping over the Arctic for surveillance of American submarine movements, photographed a peculiar distortion on the ice pack. A long, dark, linear crease, as if something massive beneath the surface had pressed upward just enough to bend the ice but not break through. The mark was almost identical in length to the missing submarine, 92 meters. But the most chilling detail was its shape, which showed a slight curvature, identical to the submarine's hull architecture. Analysts rushed to interpret the images, but the next satellite pass revealed nothing. The crease had vanished, smoothed over as if it had never existed. Ice shifts could explain the disappearance, but not the shape, precision, or timing. It was as if the submarine had risen beneath the ice, paused long enough to leave an imprint, then descended again. But why? To recharge batteries? To let the crew breathe? Or was something else controlling its ascent? Something mechanical, not human? At this point, Cold War paranoia took over. Some within the Soviet Naval High Command began suspecting sabotage. They theorized that NATO intelligence might have tampered with the submarine systems or used experimental acoustic weaponry to disable its navigation. But this theory fell apart under scrutiny. NATO lacked such underwater capabilities at the time, and no signals intelligence supported hostile activity. Another faction proposed an even darker possibility: internal betrayal. What if someone aboard intentionally disabled communications or diverted the submarine? But no motive aligned. The crew were loyal, experienced, and rigorously vetted. None had questionable backgrounds. And yet, whispers spread that the submarine's political officer, the Zampolit, responsible for ideological discipline, had filed 2 unusual reports weeks before departure, expressing concern about tension among engineering staff. These reports vanished from the archives. Families were never notified. By contrast, Western intelligence analysts developed an entirely different theory, one rooted in environmental science. The Arctic in the early 1960s was undergoing rapid ice mass shifts due to cyclical warming, causing ice keels to grow unpredictably and deep undercurrents to accelerate. A submarine attempting under-ice navigation without updated ice mapping could easily collide with a massive submerged ridge or become trapped in shifting ice corridors that compressed its hull. But even that did not explain the sonar anomalies, the movements, or the absence of debris. Submarines that implode at depth leave massive sonic signatures and detectable debris fields. This one left nothing: no implosion event, no oil slick, no hull fragments, no reactor contaminants. The ocean simply absorbed it. And then came the most unnerving development of all. 6 months after the submarine vanished, Norwegian fishermen operating near Jan Mayen Island reported hearing a low, metallic groan beneath their vessel, followed by a deep rumbling that carried through the water for nearly 30 seconds. They described it as a whale made of iron. Norwegian authorities dismissed it, but an off-duty NATO hydrophone technician later admitted that SOSUS stations recorded the same sound. originating from a point less than 200 kilometers from the submarine's last known position. The frequency and signature did not match any known submarine type, biological source, or geological event. The technician swore it sounded like a massive object shifting across the seafloor, or resurfacing. But resurfacing where? And under whose control? Months later, Soviet naval intelligence intercepted a classified American report speculating that the submarine might have become lodged within a slow-moving under-ice current, effectively drifting like a trapped glacier fragment, occasionally approaching shallower areas before being pulled back into the deep. If true, the submarine could remain intact for decades, preserved by freezing temperatures. But if false, if the submarine maintained propulsion or deliberate steering long after its disappearance, then the Soviet Navy was dealing with something unprecedented. A submarine functioning without orders, without surface support, and without communication. The ghost sub. As more time passed, the story became a quiet obsession for naval strategists. A submarine that could evade detection, drift silently under ice indefinitely, and appear sporadically on sonar would represent a nightmare scenario for NATO. And for the Soviets, it represented an open wound, a lost warship that symbolized both technological ambition and human vulnerability. But the final and most haunting clue emerged decades later, in 2007, when a Russian oceanographic expedition captured a faint metallic echo during a deep-sea survey in the Arctic basin. It was the right size, the right shape, and the right acoustic signature. But when they returned to the exact coordinates, they found nothing but empty ocean. The contact had vanished again, just as it always had. What the 2007 expedition detected should have settled the mystery, but instead it deepened it beyond anything the original Soviet investigators could have imagined, because when acoustic technicians analyzed the echo's harmonic structure, they found something impossible. The metallic resonance contained intermittent rhythmic modulations, patterns resembling controlled mechanical movement rather than the static reflection expected from a dead hull resting on the seafloor. Movements so faint and irregular that they could only come from a machine operating at minimal power, or from a structure shifting under internal pressure changes. Yet no Cold War-era submarine could have remained operational for 40 years, especially not without maintenance, fuel, or a functioning crew. Russian analysts argued that trapped air pockets collapsing inside a decomposing hull might produce such modulations, but marine physicists refuted this, explaining that after 4 decades at Arctic depths, all buoyant compartments would have imploded. All interior bulkheads would have equalized with ambient pressure, and the vessel would be acoustically inert. Others suggested seafloor tectonic movement, mimicking mechanical patterns, but that theory failed as well because the frequency bands captured did not match geological signatures. The more they studied the recording, the clearer it became. Something inside the lost submarine, or something interacting with it, was generating motion. Russian naval leadership, now working in a GTE, post-Soviet world but still deeply territorial about Cold War secrets, quietly assembled a special analysis commission. Among the files declassified for their review was a document previously hidden, even from military archivists, a transcript of the submarine's final messages, partially corrupted but revealing one line that had never been made public. It read, "Attempting resurfacing procedure. Unexpected resistance from below. Below. Not above. Not lateral. Below." This single word electrified the commission. Submarines routinely encounter ice pressure, rogue currents, and false sonar contacts. But resistance from below implied collision or obstruction from something rising, not falling. Something occupying the water column beneath them. Something large enough to interfere with the submarine's ascent. Suddenly, the crease in the ice captured by the spy satellite years earlier no longer seemed like the submarine simply pressing upward. It might have been reacting to an external force pushing it toward the surface. And if that force existed, what was it? A geological anomaly, a collapsing ice cavern, or something the military never wanted recorded? The commission explored every angle. They examined reports of massive under-ice freshwater plumes that could create buoyancy anomalies. They reviewed suppressed oceanographic data indicating the presence of ultrasaline pockets capable of generating sudden density shifts. They even interviewed retired sonar operators who, late in their careers, felt safe enough to admit that the Arctic sometimes produced low-frequency hums they could never identify. But the most compelling insight came from a retired naval engineer who had helped design the submarine's pressure hull. He explained that if a submarine were caught in a vertical hydraulic surge, an upward jet of dense water formed by catastrophic under-ice collapse, it might feel like being pushed from below by an external force. Yet no such surge was ever detected in that region, and oceanographic logs showed no anomalies of that scale. The mystery persisted. Meanwhile, Western analysts reviewing the 2007 acoustic file independently proposed an unsettling hypothesis. What if the submarine's reactor, or rather, its auxiliary battery systems, under extreme cold, had entered a state of slow, partial reactivation? In theory, the chemical batteries of mid-century Soviet submarines could undergo spontaneous depolarization events after decades underwater, generating minute electrical pulses that could cause metallic components to contract or vibrate. But even this explanation had flaws. The submarine in question was diesel-electric with minimal reactor technology and no known design features that could self-stimulate after total power loss. And even if microscopic vibrations occurred, they would not produce the rhythmic, intermittent structure recorded in 2007. Those patterns suggested intention, even if only mechanical intention, something moving, something resisting collapse, something refusing to die. But the ocean does not care for human theories. It buries them just as it buries ships. And the submarine's legend, growing each year among Russian sailors, began taking on a life of its own. Naval crews spoke of the Arctic Wanderer, a ghost sub still drifting under ice, its hull scraping ancient seabeds as it followed currents known only to the deep. Western sailors developed their own myths, claiming Sosis occasionally picked up faint metallic knocks, patterns resembling Soviet hull tap codes used during emergencies. No official logs confirmed this, but the rumors persisted, especially after an incident in 1993 when an American submarine reported faint repetitive tapping beneath its keel while patrolling the Fram Strait. The tapping stopped when the vessel changed course, as if whatever produced the sound had matched its movement. Yet when sonar was deployed, nothing appeared. The ocean gave nothing back. As Russia modernized in the 2000s, the submarine story resurfaced in unexpected ways. Environmental researchers studying deep-sea anomalies encountered metallic signatures that resembled decaying Soviet hulls, but the structures moved between scans. Defense contractors testing new Arctic surveillance equipment reported false positives, too large to be whales, yet too silent to be functioning submarines. Even satellite altimetry occasionally detected distortion patterns inconsistent with known ice morphology, hints of something long and cylindrical affecting ice flow from beneath. One classified NORAD report described a subsurface body of non-biological origin, approximate length 80-100 meters, drifting at variable speeds inconsistent with currents. The report was archived without public release. But for all the sightings, near sightings, and acoustic ghosts, no one ever captured definitive proof. And then came the rediscovery that should have rewritten Cold War history, but instead was buried under layers of classified protocol. In 2015, a Russian scientific vessel began mapping a previously inaccessible trench carved by retreating glacier formations. At 900 meters depth, side-scan sonar detected what appeared to be a long metallic object, partially embedded in silt. The geometry, the length, and even the curvature matched the missing submarine. The research team, stunned, captured as many images as possible before a sudden shift in ice pressure forced evacuation. They transmitted preliminary data to Moscow. The next day, the object disappeared. Gone. No debris. No sediment clouds. No indications of trawling or retrieval. Only freshly disturbed seafloor where the object had rested 12 hours earlier. Russian intelligence immediately seized the images and shut down the research mission. The crew signed non-disclosure agreements under threat of criminal prosecution. And once again, the submarine had slipped into the ocean's folds like a creature that preferred not to be found. By this point, Western and Russian military analysts had independently reached a chilling consensus. The submarine was not stationary. It was moving, slowly, unpredictably, but undeniably shifting over decades, too consistently to be random drift, too irregular to be purely current-driven. Something was keeping the hull intact despite pressures that should have crumpled it. Something was preventing total structural collapse. Something was delaying entropy. A few Russian theorists speculated that methane hydrate deposits, vast crystalline structures beneath the Arctic floor, might periodically lift or shift the submarine, giving the illusion of movement. Others believed under-ice brine channels with extreme salinity gradients might create temporary buoyancy differentials. But these theories only addressed small movements, not the large-scale relocations documented by sonar contacts decades apart. The truth remained elusive. Yet the most extraordinary theory came not from military analysts, but from a forgotten Cold War oceanographer whose private notes survived in a family archive. He proposed that the Arctic might contain a little understood category of acoustic dead zones, regions where sound behaves abnormally due to unique thermocline layering. He speculated that large objects caught inside these zones could remain invisible to sonar for decades, only becoming detectable when moving through the acoustic boundary. If the submarine drifted within such zones, it could appear and disappear like a phantom, occasionally leaving traces, but never long enough to track. Modern simulations suggest this is plausible, but even this does not explain the rhythmic, mechanical signals, the ice crease shaped like the hull, or the corrosion-resistant integrity of a vessel that should have rotted into fragments long ago. What remains is a ghost, a machine that refuses classification, confined to an ocean that conceals as much as it reveals. And as Arctic ice melts, shipping lanes expand, and new nations push northward, the legend only grows. Sailors still whisper about metallic groans beneath midnight ice. Submarine crews still report phantom echoes following their patrols. And NATO hydrophone operators occasionally hear faint, patterned knocks. Knocks that resemble old Soviet emergency codes, drifting through water like memories refusing to fade. And somewhere in the Arctic, the ocean holds its secrets, perhaps forever, or perhaps until the submarine surfaces again, not by force of nature, but by intention. For all the mythologizing surrounding the lost submarine, for all the speculation, secrecy, and Cold War paranoia folded into its legend, the most unsettling revelation emerged not from a classified military lab, nor from a deep-sea recovery attempt, but from a forgotten Soviet research station whose archives were rediscovered in 2019 during a routine renovation. In a neglected basement room filled with rusted typewriters and mold-eaten logbooks, historians found a sealed crate containing magnetic tapes recorded by Arctic monitoring arrays between 1961 and 1964. The tapes included hydrophone logs never processed by the Soviet Navy at the time, likely abandoned after the project lost funding. When digitized and cleaned, the recordings revealed months of low-frequency underwater signatures, charting the movements of Soviet vessels across the polar waters. But among the data was a series of acoustic anomalies between July and September of the submarine's final operational year. Anomalies that matched no known Soviet hull. The patterns indicated an object traveling at extreme depth, occasionally rising toward the surface, but then descending again sharply, as if pulled downward by enormous force or drawn into a trench. Analysts determined that some anomalies corresponded to internal metallic reverberations, hull stresses amplified into sharp, ringing tones, suggesting the submarine was fighting immense pressure differentials even before it transmitted its final message. Yet the strangest part was not the acoustic stress signatures, but the moments when the submarine appeared to stop entirely, remaining perfectly still for hours or even days in zones known for violent currents, as if anchored by something unknown. Hydrodynamic models could not explain this. A diesel-electric submarine drifting power off should have moved predictably with the flow of the ocean. But here the vector plots showed deliberate pausing, sometimes followed by upward thrust, resembling controlled ballast adjustments. Researchers initially dismissed the upward thrust readings as equipment noise, but the pattern persisted too consistently, repeating almost rhythmically, forming what looked like an ascent attempt aborted multiple times. It was only when the team mapped these attempts against known tectonic structures beneath the ice that a chilling hypothesis emerged. The submarine may have been trapped, not mechanically, but hydrologically, caught in a rare vertical pressure trap where dense supercooled brine layers create downward suction zones analogous to atmospheric downdrafts, powerful enough to hold a submarine in place or drag it deeper if its engine struggled. Only one problem: such brine-driven suction phenomena are theoretically possible, but have never been recorded at the scale required to capture a military submarine. Furthermore, the log showed abrupt, violent deviations inconsistent with fluid dynamics, deviations too sudden, too forceful, too mechanical. It was as if the submarine were fighting not just the sea, but something actively resisting its ascent. Just as the team prepared to publish their findings, a retired Soviet sonar analyst, now in his 80s, contacted them unexpectedly. He revealed that during the submarine's final months, Northern Fleet Command grew concerned about unusual acoustic shadows trailing several vessels. Shadows that moved erratically and seemed to stalk submarine patrol routes at depth. The analyst described them as massive, silent silhouettes that never emitted propulsion noise. He admitted that his colleagues unofficially referred to them as Arctic ghosts. The Navy dismissed these shadows as false echoes caused by temperature gradients, until one shadow abruptly vanished the same week the submarine disappeared. When the historians cross-referenced the acoustic anomalies with the analyst's logs, they found overlapping coordinates, the same underwater zone, the same week, the same patterns. Yet what exactly constituted the shadow remained unknowable. The ocean is too deep, too unobserved, and too good at hiding what lives within it, especially under polar ice where sunlight cannot reach. Meanwhile, new sonar techniques introduced in the 2020s inadvertently added more fuel to the mystery. A Norwegian research team conducting polar tomography detected a long, cylindrical object drifting under the ice sheet near a glacial cavity, moving very slowly. They suspected it was an ice-trapped shipping container or a lost scientific instrument until one scan showed a protruding structure resembling a conning tower. The object vanished from subsequent scans, but the sonar imprint was preserved. Independent analysts reviewing the northwest Russian coastline detected a phenomenon equally bizarre: tidal fluctuations in narrow fjords that did not match weather patterns, as if some massive body beneath the water displaced huge volumes periodically. Coastal fishermen reported hearing metal dragging beneath their boats on calm nights. And in 2021, a Russian icebreaker crew captured infrared footage of a heat plume rising through a crack in the ice, too large for marine mammals, too slow for volcanic vents, too local to be geothermal, and directly above a known possible resting place of the submarine. The heat plume persisted for 18 minutes, then ceased abruptly. No follow-up detections were made. Attempts by the Russian Navy to investigate were halted by severe storms, shifting ice, and later bureaucratic obstruction. The Arctic has little interest in being probed, and even less interest in revealing its dead. But the most confounding evidence arrived in 2022, when an AI-assisted reinterpretation of Cold War magnetic anomaly maps revealed a migration path carved across the Arctic seafloor. Anomalies consistent with a large ferromagnetic object drifting over decades, carving subtle grooves through sediment, almost like the track of a colossal, buried creature. The grooves moved northward, then west, then in unpredictable loops before disappearing under a deep trench. Preliminary calculations suggested the object followed a path that would require occasional bursts of buoyancy, moments when the object rose several meters before settling again. Natural drift cannot account for this pattern. Tidal forces cannot either. Only something intermittently adjusting its internal density could. But what? The submarine had no functioning crew, no power, no control systems. Yet something that resembled its profile moved beneath the ice long after it should have collapsed into metallic dust. This is where official explanations diverge sharply from those whispered among naval officers. The Navy insists the submarine was carried by deep gyres that have yet to be fully mapped, but oceanographers dispute this, arguing that the observed migration contradicts all known Arctic circulation models. Others claim Russian special operations teams recovered the submarine covertly, but no retrieval equipment or salvage scars appear in satellite imaging. And military analysts from NATO dismiss the entire story as misinformation, publicly at least. Privately, several admit the Arctic contains acoustic signatures that remain unexplained even with today's sensors. One U.S. submarine commander confessed in a 2018 interview that he once ordered his crew to stop all machinery after an unknown metallic tapping followed their vessel for almost 15 minutes. The taps matched no marine life. When the submarine changed depth, the tapping changed depth with them. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The commander never filed the incident. Some things cannot be explained without attracting the wrong attention. But perhaps the most unsettling testimony came from a Russian hydrographer who served 4 decades mapping under ice channels. In a rare moment of candor, he said the Arctic is not empty, only quiet, and hinted that something large and artificial occasionally disturbs the deep, leaving trails of turbulence in its wake. When asked whether it might be the lost submarine, he simply replied, "If it is, then it no longer behaves like a submarine." And that is the heart of the mystery. The object resembles the submarine in every measurable way, yet its movements, durability, and acoustic signature defy everything we know about abandoned Cold War machinery. Submarines are engineering marvels, but they are not immortal. They rust, they collapse, they return to the earth. Yet this one appears to persist, wandering the deep like a relic animated by unseen forces, currents, pressure anomalies, or something else entirely. Whether the submarine is truly drifting or being carried by the Arctic's hidden hydraulic labyrinths is almost irrelevant now. What matters is this: the ocean recorded something. The ice saw something. The machines captured something. And the men who spent their lives listening to the deep all agree that whatever moves beneath the polar night is vast, metallic, and disturbingly familiar, and perhaps, in its own ghostly way, still alive. In the end, the question of the lost submarine becomes less about machinery and metal, and more about the strange, indifferent intelligence of the Arctic itself, a realm so vast and ancient that human technology seems like a brief spark swallowed by an ocean that has existed since before our species learned to shape iron. Yet despite the submarine's official designation as lost with all hands, its shadow lingers in a way that no sunken vessel ever has. A lingering presence felt not only through sonar anomalies, but through the uneasy testimonies of the sailors who have spent their careers patrolling those waters and who insist the Arctic possesses memory, that it remembers the submarine, remembers the violence of its final struggle, remembers the echo of steel cracking under pressure, and has chosen, for reasons unknown, not to relinquish its grip. And perhaps the most unnerving aspect of this story is the knowledge that the submarine's disappearance was not a clean event, not a sudden catastrophic implosion, or a neat vanishing act that could be tidily explained by engineering charts or naval protocols. Instead, what we see is a prolonged narrative of distress signals, halted ascents, strange shadows moving beneath the hull, bursts of acoustic energy that resemble mechanical resistance, and sonar traces that appear and vanish like a heartbeat, slowing over decades rather than flatlining. Even the ice above, the same ice that crushes ships into splinters, seems to have recorded the submarine's presence through the scars it left, as though the vessel became part of the Arctic's geology in the same way fossils become part of stone. And so, the submarine exists in a space between myth and evidence, too documented to dismiss yet too contradictory to fully accept, haunting the boundary between human engineering and the vast forces that operate beneath polar seas. It is this uncertainty that fuels the legend. The sense that something in the deep continues to move, something once technological, but now transformed by pressure, darkness, and time into a hybrid of environment and artifact. When modern Russian analysts privately admit they no longer believe the submarine rests in one place, they speak not with fear, but with a kind of reluctant awe, as though acknowledging that the Arctic has sculpted the vessel into a creature of its own domain, a relic animated not by engines or crew, but by the slow, crushing physics of a world humans were never meant to conquer. And yet, the submarine story refuses to conclude neatly. New sightings, always unofficial, always unverified, appear every few years like echoes of an unresolved tragedy. A Norwegian aircraft detecting a massive heat signature beneath fractured ice. A crew of trawler fishermen hearing what they described as metal breathing. A classified U.S. Navy memo noting that sonar operators intercepted patterned bursts of low-frequency knocking, consistent with Soviet emergency hull tap codes. These incidents would be easy to dismiss as superstition, if not for one undeniable truth. There is only one object in the Arctic that matches the acoustic profile of those taps, and it is the submarine that should not be moving, should not be generating heat, should not be leaving fresh scars across the seafloor more than 60 years after vanishing. And so the world is left with a riddle suspended in the twilight of a geopolitical era now long gone. A machine built for war that became, in its disappearance, something larger than the nation that constructed it and the sailors who served inside it. The Arctic keeps its secrets, yes, but it also reveals them in fragments, as though teasing the limits of human understanding. Perhaps the submarine lies crushed in a trench, drifting between layers of brine too thick for sonar to penetrate. Perhaps the anomalies are coincidence layered upon coincidence, a pattern perceived where none exists. But perhaps, in the deep where no light has ever touched, the vessel persists, its hull hardened by time, its chambers filled with silt and freezing water, and yet still intact enough to occasionally resonate, to vibrate, to speak in faint metallic language the ocean has learned to repeat. Or perhaps the truth is even simpler, that the Arctic itself claimed the submarine as one of its own, absorbing it into currents and ice flows so complex they seem almost intentional, carrying the whole like a massive drifting seed through underwater valleys and over mountains of ancient stone, always out of reach of human recovery, but never beyond the range of myth. And if one day the ice melts enough to reveal what the submarine has become, whether a skeleton of rust or a near-pristine capsule preserved by cold so absolute it halts decay, what will matter most is not the vessel's condition, but the story it represents. The story of how, even in an age dominated by nuclear arsenals and superpower rivalry, the greatest forces at play were not man-made but elemental, indifferent, and utterly beyond control. The submarine's ghost, whether real or imagined, is a reminder that the Cold War unfolded not only across continents and skies, but also in the deepest oceans, where the boundaries of human power dissolve, and the world belongs once again to pressure, darkness, and silence. And maybe, just maybe, somewhere beneath the drifting ice and the black water that stretches endlessly across the pole, a shape still moves in the shadows, long, cylindrical, impossibly intact, following currents known only to itself, a steel corpse that refuses to rest, a relic of a war that never turned hot, wandering a sea too cold to forget.